Texas had always been home to its share of horse ranchers, but Miguel Reyes was different. For 2 decades, he'd quietly operated his sprawling Vista Ridge Ranch in the Chisos Basin, known only as the solitary horseman who bred some of the finest quarter horses in the state. The locals saw nothing unusual about the weathered Mexican-American who kept to himself, never noticing how his dark eyes constantly scanned horizons and exits, or suspecting why he'd chosen this particular stretch of land with its commanding view of the border country. That all changed the day the Sinaloa Cartel's black SUVs rolled onto his property, their engines shattering the dawn silence. They couldn't have known that the quiet rancher watching from his stable had been waiting for them, had chosen this remote valley precisely because men like them would eventually come. They were about to learn what others had discovered too late, that sometimes the deadliest predator is the one who spent years perfecting his ambush. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted long shadows across Vista Ridge Ranch. As Miguel finished his dawn routine, methodically checking each of his prized horses. 20 years of the same pattern had earned him a reputation for precision among the local ranching community. Every morning, like clockwork, he'd start before sunrise, examining hooves, measuring feed, testing water quality. The stable hands he employed knew better than to question his exactness. The results spoke for themselves in the championship bloodlines he'd cultivated. Sarah Martinez wiped down the counter at the border cafe, watching Miguel through the window as he tied his black stallion to the hitching post outside. 2 decades of serving him breakfast, and she still couldn't quite read him. There was something in the way he moved, a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his calloused rancher's hands. "Morning, Mr. Reyes," she called as he entered, the bell above the door chiming softly. "The usual?" Miguel nodded, taking his regular booth by the window. From there he had a clear view of both the street and the hills beyond town. Sarah brought his coffee black, no sugar, and the day's newspaper. Some things never changed. Sheriff Tom Wilson entered moments later, removing his hat as he approached the counter. His deputy, Maria Gonzalez, followed close behind, her sharp eyes taking in the near-empty cafe. "Quiet morning, Sarah," Wilson said, settling onto a stool. "Miguel giving you any trouble?" Sarah smiled, pouring their coffee, still waiting on him to say more than 3 words together. Miguel appeared absorbed in his paper, but his shoulders tensed imperceptibly at the sound of approaching vehicles. Heavy engines, multiple vehicles moving in formation, not the usual ranch trucks or tourist SUVs that occasionally wandered through the basin. Through the window, he watched 4 black Escalades pull into the cafe's lot, their windows tinted, well beyond legal limits. The vehicles arranged themselves with tactical precision, 1 blocking the exit, 2 flanking, 1 in front. Miguel recognized the formation from another life. The cafe's conversations died as men emerged from the vehicles. They wore expensive suits despite the Texas heat, their movements disciplined, hands never far from their jackets. Miguel counted 8 in total, noting their positions, analyzing their formation with practiced ease. The leader entered first, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the cold calculation in his eyes. 2 guards flanked him, their bulging jackets failing to hide their shoulder holsters. "Buenos dias," the leader called out, his accent pure Sinaloa. "Hope we're not interrupting breakfast." Sheriff Wilson straightened, one hand casually dropping to his gun belt. Something we can help you gentlemen with? The leader smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just passing through, Senor Sheriff, looking to make some local business, investments. His gaze swept the cafe before settling on Miguel. Actually, I was hoping to speak with Senor Reyes. Miguel folded his newspaper with deliberate care, laying a 20 beneath his coffee cup. The leader approached his booth, his guards maintaining their positions by the door. "I'm Javier Escalante," the man said, sliding uninvited into the booth opposite Miguel. "My associates and I have been admiring your property, especially that prime location overlooking the valley. We're interested in discussing a purchase." Miguel met his eyes briefly. "Not for sale." Escalante's smile tightened. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately. The price would be very generous." "No discussion needed." Miguel stood, his movements unhurried but precise. Escalante's hand shot out, gripping Miguel's wrist. "I insist." What happened next occurred so quickly that most witnesses would later disagree on the sequence of events. Somehow, Escalante found himself face down on the table, his arm twisted at an angle that made him gasp. His guards reached for their weapons, but froze as Miguel's voice cut through the silence. "Touch me again," he said softly in perfect Sinaloa Spanish, "and you'll learn why some men are left alone, for good reasons." He released Escalante and walked out, leaving the cafe in stunned silence. Through the window they watched him mount his horse and ride away, his posture relaxed as if nothing had happened. "Jesus," Deputy Gonzalez whispered. "What was that?" Sheriff Wilson studied Miguel's departing figure with new eyes. "That, Deputy, was our first glimpse of something interesting." Outside, the cartel men helped Escalante to his feet. Their faces were hard with anger, but there was something else in their eyes now, uncertainty and the first glimmers of fear. Back at the ranch, Miguel stood on his front porch, watching the sun climb higher. He could see the lights of town. Below, peaceful for now. His phone buzzed, an old flip phone, deliberately basic. The text was simple: "They're moving." Miguel deleted the message and went inside. In his study, he opened a hidden panel behind a painting of wild horses, revealing a wall of surveillance photos, maps, and documents. The Sinaloa Cartel featured prominently: their routes, their operations, their key players across 3 states. 20 years of patient observation waiting for them to push into this territory. In town, Escalante nursed his wounded pride and arm at the local motel, speaking rapidly into his phone. "Jefe, we may have a situation. This rancher. There's something about him, moves like military, maybe special forces." The voice of Diego El Coyote Montoya, one of the cartel's most feared leaders, crackled through the phone. "Interesting. Keep watching him. I'm coming to see this for myself." Emma Thompson, closing up her hardware store across from the motel, overheard enough to send her hurrying to the border cafe. Sarah was wiping down tables when she arrived, breathless with news. "They're calling in their boss," Emma reported. Something about Miguel scared them. Sarah looked around at the worried faces of her regular customers. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, the way they've been pushing into town, asking questions about property sales, making veiled threats. Dr. James Chen spoke up from his corner table. "Question is, what happens when they push back, and what's Miguel's part in all this?" Sheriff Wilson stood, adjusting his gun belt. "Guess we're about to find out. But I get the feeling our quiet rancher might be exactly what this town needs right now." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As night fell over the Chisos Basin, the pieces were being set for a conflict that would shake the entire region. Miguel cleaned his weapons with practiced efficiency, while, in a motel room 30 miles away, Diego Montoya studied satellite images of the valley, planning his next move. The calm before the storm was about to break, and when it did, secrets, long buried, would finally come to light. In town, Sarah locked up the cafe, her mind on the morning's events. 20 years of serving Miguel breakfast, and she'd never suspected he was anything more than a dedicated rancher. Now she wondered what else those quiet mornings had hidden, what other secrets lay behind his careful eyes. "Things are changing," Emma said, joining her outside. "Question is, are we ready for what's coming?" Sarah looked toward Vista Ridge Ranch, barely visible in the gathering darkness. Maybe the real question is, were they ready for Miguel? The night deepened, but few in the basin slept soundly. Change was coming, carried on the wings of violence and old secrets. But as the stars wheeled overhead, Miguel Reyes stood watch, patient as always, waiting for the storm he'd spent 20 years preparing to weather. The morning brought a convoy of black SUVs and armored vehicles rolling into the Chisos Basin, their arrival marking the end of whatever peace the town had known. Diego El Coyote Montoya sat in the lead vehicle, his scarred face studying the landscape with predatory focus. Twin gold crucifixes glinted at his neck, one for God's blessing, he often said, one for the souls he'd sent to judgment. The Escalades formed a protective escort around their leader, dust rising from their wheels as they wound through the desert roads. At her hardware store, Emma Thompson watched them pass, her hand already reaching for her phone to activate the town's warning system. A simple chain of calls and texts that had developed organically over years of looking out for each other. "Mary," she called to her assistant, "spread the word and check our security cameras are running." The girl nodded, already typing rapidly on her phone. The convoy didn't stop until it reached the border cafe. Montoya emerged unhurried, his expensive Italian suit impeccable despite the desert heat. Javier Escalante hurried to his side, speaking rapidly in hushed tones and gesturing toward Vista Ridge Ranch, visible on the distant hills. Inside the cafe, Sarah kept her expression neutral as Montoya approached the counter. His reputation preceded him. Stories of villages burned, rivals disappeared, entire families erased for standing in his way. "Coffee, black," he said, his voice carrying the rough edge of authority, "and a word with the owner." "You're talking to her," Sarah replied, pouring his coffee without meeting his eyes. "Beautiful place you have here," Montoya smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Shame if anything happened to it." Before Sarah could respond, the bell above the door chimed. Miguel walked in, his boots quiet on the wooden floor, moving toward his usual booth as if nothing had changed. The cafe fell silent as he passed, Montoya seemingly oblivious to the cartel leader's presence. "Senor Reyes," Montoya called out, turning to face him, "I've heard interesting things about you." Miguel sat down, unfolding his newspaper with deliberate care. Montoya approached his booth, coffee in hand, sliding into the seat opposite without invitation. His bodyguards moved to flank the booth, hands beneath their jackets. "See, I did. Them checking after yesterday's misunderstanding," Montoya continued. "Interesting thing about records. Sometimes what's missing tells you more than what's there. Your history before Vista Ridge, it's remarkably thin." Miguel looked up from his paper, meeting Montoya's gaze for a long moment. Not much to tell. I disagree. Montoya's smile turned predatory, like why a man who breeds championship horses chose this particular piece of land. Perfect view of the valley, clear lines of sight, multiple escape routes, almost like someone with experience. Picked it. Good grazing, Miguel replied softly. Good water. Montoya leaned forward, lowering his voice. I have plans for this valley, Señor Reyes. Plans that could benefit everyone. All I need is cooperation. He paused, studying Miguel's impassive face. Your land is perfect for what we need. Name your price. Already did. Not for sale. Everything's for sale. Montoya's voice hardened. Question is whether the seller walks away happy or doesn't walk away at all. Miguel folded his paper carefully, laying his usual $5 beneath his coffee cup. As he passed Montoya, he paused. You've got it backward, he said quietly. Question is whether the buyer learns to walk away or doesn't walk at all. The threat hung in the air as Miguel left. Montoya's face darkened with rage, but there was something else in his expression. Recognition. He'd seen something in Miguel's eyes that troubled him, something familiar from his own world of violence and power. Outside, Sheriff Wilson waited by his patrol car. Quite a show of force they're bringing, he said as Miguel passed. Going to get worse, Miguel replied, mounting his horse. Maybe it's time you told me what's really going on here. Miguel studied the sheriff for a moment. Best you don't know yet, but keep your deputy close. Storm's coming. Back inside, Montoya was already on his phone. Run everything again. Military records, law enforcement, federal databases. I want to know who we're dealing with. And get me everything on his ranch operations. Suppliers, buyers, employees, everyone he's connected to. At her hardware store, Emma Richardson was having her own revelation. She'd lived in the basin for 40 years, kept records of every major transaction. Something about Miguel's land purchase had always bothered her. She pulled out the old deed records, studying them with fresh eyes. Mary, she called, bring me the maps from the county surveyor's office, the old ones. As morning turned to afternoon, the cartel's presence grew more obvious. Pairs of men in tactical gear patrolled the streets, memorizing layouts, noting security cameras. They paid particular attention to the police station, the bank, and the roads leading to Vista Ridge Ranch. Dr. Chen, watching from his clinic window, made a call to an old friend in the DEA. The call went straight to voicemail. Jack, it's James. Chen, remember that favor you owe me. Time to pay up. Need everything you can find on Diego Montoya and the Sinaloa Cartel. And while you're at it, look into Miguel Reyes. Something's not adding up. At his ranch, Miguel watched the valley through high-powered binoculars. Montoya's men were professional. He had to give them that. They were establishing a perimeter, setting up observation posts disguised as camping spots. But they hadn't found his cameras yet, the ones he'd spent 20 years placing at strategic points throughout the valley. His secure laptop showed feeds from these hidden cameras, recording faces, license plates, conversations. 20 years of patience was about to pay off. The cartel thought they were setting a trap, never realizing they were walking into one that had been waiting for them since before they even knew this valley existed. In town, Sarah closed her cafe early, something she hadn't done in 20 years. As she locked up, she noticed Emma hurrying toward her, clutching old documents. "Sarah," Emma called out, breathless. "You need to see this." The property records, the surveys. Miguel didn't just buy that land. He chose it, every acre specifically. The ranch house is placed to overlook every major route through the valley, like someone planning for a siege, Sarah murmured. Or someone setting a trap, Emma added. Night fell over the Chisos Basin, but few slept. Montoya's men established themselves in the motel, their vehicles arranged in defensive positions. In his room, Montoya studied satellite images of Vista Ridge Ranch, marking potential approaches and weaknesses. "Boss," Escalante reported. And contact in the DEA came through. You're not going to believe what we found." Montoya read the file, his face growing increasingly grave. "Get everyone together," he ordered. "Now!" At the ranch, Miguel sat in darkness, methodically cleaning an array of weapons. His phone buzzed with another text. "Files accessed. They know." Miguel deleted the message, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. The pieces were falling into place exactly as he'd planned. Tomorrow would bring violence. There was no avoiding that now. But violence had been his teacher for longer than these men knew, and he'd learned its lessons well. In the sheriff's office, Wilson received his own revelation via encrypted email. The documents made him sit back, whistling softly. "Son of a gun," he muttered, staring at Miguel's true identity. All this time. The stage was set. Dawn would bring a reckoning 20 years in the making, and the Chisos Basin was about to learn why some quiet men are best left undisturbed. But as the stars wheeled overhead, Miguel Reyes, a name that had served him well for 2 decades, felt only the calm certainty of a plan long in motion, finally approaching its moment of truth. Sarah, unable to sleep, stood at her kitchen window looking toward Vista Ridge Ranch. The lights were dark, but she knew Miguel was awake, watching, waiting. 20 years of serving him coffee, and only now did she realize she'd been watching over a legend without knowing it. "Whatever's coming," she whispered to the darkness, "I hope we're ready." The night deepened, but the tension in the valley only grew. At the motel, Montoya's men checked weapons and communications, preparing for what their leader had promised would be a significant operation. None of them noticed the small red lights of hidden cameras recording their every move, feeding information to a system 20 years in the making. Emma worked late into the night, piecing together the puzzle of old records. The more she dug, the more she understood. Miguel hadn't just bought a ranch. He'd created a fortress, a trap, a killing ground, disguised as a peaceful horse-breeding operation. Every detail, from the placement of the fences to the angles of the security lights, served a dual purpose. Dr. Chen received an encrypted file from his DEA contact. Reading it, he understood why Miguel had chosen this particular valley, this specific moment. The pieces of a 20-year plan were finally becoming clear, and the picture they formed was both brilliant and terrifying. In his motel room, Montoya stared at the DEA file, his face illuminated by the laptop's glow. The name, buried in the records, explained everything. Why this ranch? Why this valley? Why now? 20 years ago, he'd heard stories of an operation that had nearly destroyed the cartel's northern networks. The man responsible had disappeared, leaving only whispers and a body count that had become cartel legend. Now he knew where that man had gone, what he'd been doing all these years. The quiet rancher-breeding championship horses had been building something else entirely. A trap that could destroy everything Montoya had built. But knowing the trap existed didn't mean he could avoid it. Too much was invested, too many pieces in motion. Dawn would bring violence to the Chisos Basin, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. At Vista Ridge Ranch, Miguel stood on his porch, watching the stars. 20 years of patience had led to this moment. Tomorrow, the cartel would learn why he'd chosen this place, why he'd waited so long, why some legends are best left to history. But for now, he simply watched and waited, as he had for 20 years, knowing that the best traps are the ones your enemies walk into willingly, believing themselves the hunters rather than the prey. Sheriff Wilson sat at his desk, staring at the classified files scattered before him, each page revealing another layer of a 20-year-old mystery. Miguel Reyes wasn't just any former law enforcement officer. He was Commander Miguel El Fantasma Reyes, the legendary DEA deep-cover operative who had dismantled the largest drug trafficking operation in the Southwest before vanishing without a trace. The morning stillness shattered as black SUVs roared past the sheriff's office. Wilson looked up to see cartel members positioning themselves at strategic points throughout town. Their message clear: the Chisos Basin was being locked down. The radio crackled. "Sheriff, we've got trouble at the bank." Deputy Gonzalez's voice was tense. 6 of Montoya's men just went in armed. "On my way." Wilson grabbed his jacket, then paused. He picked up his phone and dialed Miguel's number. "Already watching," Miguel's quiet voice answered on the first ring. "Don't engage yet." "Don't engage! They're taking over my town." "They think they are. Watch the bank's west side." Wilson moved to his window as Montoya's men emerged from the bank with the manager. A familiar figure on horseback appeared at the corner. Miguel sat motionless, his mere presence causing the cartel members to freeze. "That's far enough," Miguel's voice carried clearly across the morning air. "This doesn't concern you, old man," one of the cartel members growled, but his hand trembled on his weapon. "Let him go," Miguel said softly, "or I start reminding you why they called me El Fantasma." The bank manager's eyes widened. Even the cartel members reacted to the name. Miguel's reputation from his DEA days still carried weight in certain circles. Montoya emerged from his SUV, clapping slowly. "Now it makes sense. The legendary ghost hiding out as a rancher. I thought you died in that Juarez raid." "A lot of people thought that," Miguel replied. "Same people thought you'd never rebuild after I took down your operation in Nogales." The revelation hit the gathering crowd like a thunderbolt. Montoya's face twisted with recognition and rage. You're the one who killed my brother. Your brother killed himself when he chose to use children as drug mules. I just delivered the consequence." The tension in the street could have been cut with a knife. Montoya's men had their hands on weapons, but none dared draw. They'd all heard stories of El Fantasma's speed, how he'd earned his nickname by appearing silently out of nowhere, taking down entire crews before they knew what hit them. "Times change, Commander." Montoya spat the title like poison. "You're not dealing with street thugs anymore. I've got 50 men in this town, more coming. You're one man." Miguel's smile was cold as desert frost. "You've got 50 men in my pillbox. Been setting this up since before you knew this valley existed." As if on cue, red dots appeared on the chests of Montoya's men. Laser sights from hidden positions Miguel had spent years preparing, placing cameras and weapons caches throughout the town. "Jesus," Deputy Gonzalez whispered to Wilson. "He turned the whole valley into a trap." "Let the manager go," Miguel repeated. Then we talk about how this ends. Montoya's men looked to their leader, sweat visible on their faces despite the cool morning. The bank manager was released, scurrying to safety. "This isn't over," Montoya snarled, but he was already backing toward his vehicle. "Oh, but it is," Miguel replied. "Been watching your operation grow. The drug routes through Texas, the human trafficking, the gun running. Got it all documented, just waiting for you to walk into my web." Montoya's face went pale. 20 years of building his empire, and Miguel had been watching, gathering evidence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sarah emerged from her cafe. "All this time," she said, approaching Miguel, "you've been protecting us." "Town needed someone watching," Miguel replied simply. "Seemed like a good place to set a trap." Sheriff Wilson joined them, shaking his head in amazement. "The ranch purchase, the strategic position, the quiet routine, it was all part of your plan. Best ambush is the one they walk into willingly." Miguel dismounted. "Montoya's been looking to expand north for years, knew he'd eventually try to set up here. Valley's perfect for his operation, remote, multiple escape routes, good cover for movement." "So you've just been waiting?" Wilson asked. "Gathering evidence, building cases, setting up surveillance. Network of cameras covers every inch of this valley. Got enough to put him away for life once he makes his big move. And when will that be?" Miguel's eyes tracked Montoya's retreating SUV. "Tonight. He's too proud to run, too smart to wait. He'll hit hard, try to overwhelm us with numbers." "Us?" Wilson raised an eyebrow. "Your town, Sheriff. Your call." Wilson looked around at the faces of his townspeople, scared but determined. They'd just learned their quiet rancher was actually a legend of law enforcement, a man who'd sacrificed everything to bring down criminals like Montoya. "Well," Wilson smiled grimly, "suppose we ought to get ready then." The next few hours transformed the Chisos Basin. Under Miguel's guidance, defensive positions were established. Emma's hardware store became a command center, its back room filled, with surveillance monitors showing feeds from Miguel's hidden cameras. Dr. Chen prepared his clinic for casualties, while Sarah's cafe became a staging area. At his ranch, Miguel opened a hidden bunker beneath his barn, revealing an arsenal of legal weapons and tactical gear. "Been collecting evidence for 20 years, he told Wilson as they surveyed the equipment. "Waiting for Montoya to get overconfident, to bring his whole operation into one place. Only way to ensure we get the entire organization. Why not just arrest him earlier? Needed him to commit everything, bring in all his resources. Only way to ensure we get the entire organization." Miguel checked his rifles methodically. "Tonight he'll try to make an example of this town. Instead, he'll give us everything we need to tear his empire down." As sunset approached, more cartel vehicles arrived, bringing their numbers to nearly 70. Montoya had called in every available member, determined to crush any resistance. What he didn't know was that Miguel had planned for exactly this. Every arrival was photographed, every license plate logged, every face added to the evidence that would eventually bury the entire organization. Sarah organized teams of volunteers, distributing emergency medical supplies and communications equipment. "Never thought I'd see the day," she told Emma, "when our quiet little town would stand up to the cartels." "We're not standing alone," Emma replied, watching Miguel coordinate with Wilson's deputies. "We've got our own ghost on our side." Dr. Chen moved through the groups, teaching basic first aid. "Remember," he instructed, "we're not just fighting for our town. We're fighting for every community these people have terrorized. The storm was about to break over the Chisos Basin, but for the first time in 20 years, Miguel El Fantasma Reyes allowed himself a small smile. The trap was set, and the ghosts of his past were about to learn why some legends never die. Deputy Gonzalez, checking her weapon, caught the expression. "You've been planning this for so long," she said. "Weren't you ever tempted to just walk away?" Miguel's eyes grew distant. "Some things are worth waiting for. Some wrongs need to be made right no matter how long it takes." He looked around at the townspeople preparing to defend their home. Besides, found something worth protecting here. The sun set over the Chisos Basin, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. In his command center, Montoya prepared for what he promised would be a night of terror. But as darkness fell, it was his men who felt the first stirrings of fear, wondering if the stories they'd heard about El Fantasma were more than just legends. They were about to learn that some ghosts are very real indeed. Darkness fell over the Chisos Basin like a heavy shroud, broken only by strategic pools of light from carefully positioned street lamps. Miguel stood in Emma's store, studying the surveillance feeds, while Montoya's men took up positions around the town's perimeter, unaware that their every move was being recorded, analyzed, and transmitted to secure locations across 3 states. "They're splitting into 6 groups," Miguel noted, his voice barely above a whisper, "just like cartels always do, predictable in their unpredictability." Sheriff Wilson checked his weapon. "How do you know their playbook so well?" "Because I wrote part of it," Miguel said. 15 years undercover with the Sinaloa Cartel, before I was Miguel Reyes, trained some of their best tacticians. Now I get to use every lesson against them." Through the monitors, they watched cartel members moving into position. Montoya had indeed split his forces, 30 men in the main force, smaller teams flanking from multiple directions. Their movements were coordinated, professional, but to Miguel's experienced eye, they were walking into exactly the kill zones he'd prepared over 2 decades. Sarah's voice crackled over their radios. "Got 12 of them moving past the cafe. They're setting up heavy weapons." "Remember," Miguel instructed, "no one engages unless directly threatened. Let them think they've got us pinned down. Let them get comfortable." Montoya's voice boomed through a megaphone. "Commander Reyes, last chance to surrender. You're surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from support." Miguel picked up his radio, a rare smile touching his lips. "Interesting. I was about to say the same to you." The attack began with a surge of vehicles rushing into town from multiple directions. Gunfire erupted as cartel members shot out streetlights, trying to create confusion. They didn't realize every broken light was forcing them exactly where Miguel wanted them. "They're in position," Miguel announced. "Sheriff, your town, your call." Wilson nodded grimly. "Light 'em up." Suddenly, powerful floodlights blazed from concealed positions, catching the cartel members in a harsh crossfire of illumination. Simultaneously, police sirens wailed from multiple directions. Not just Wilson's deputies, but state troopers Miguel had quietly positioned in the surrounding hills. "What the hell?" Escalante's voice crackled over the cartel radio frequency, which Miguel had been monitoring for weeks. "Boss, we've got movement on all sides." Montoya's main force found themselves caught in the open, channeled by Miguel's strategically parked vehicles into preset firing positions. When the first shots came, they were precise and coordinated. Years of quiet preparation had turned the town's defenders into an efficient fighting force. Teams of 3, Miguel's voice was calm on the radio. Just like we practiced. Controlled. Fire, conserve ammunition. Remember, we're not here to kill them. We're here to build a case. The cartel's initial assault faltered as they realized their superior numbers meant nothing. Every route they tried had been blocked or trapped. Every position of cover they sought had already been ranged and targeted. "Boss!" Escalante's panic was evident. "They're picking us apart." Montoya, watching from his command position, finally understood. "It's a tactical funnel," he growled. "Every street, every alley. He's been designing this battlefield for years." Miguel moved through the shadows like his old nickname suggested, his rifle cracking with lethal precision. Each shot was carefully placed, wounding rather than killing, disabling rather than destroying. He wasn't just fighting, he was building a case, creating witnesses who would later testify. "Federal agents!" A new voice thundered through the night. "This is the DEA. You are surrounded." Montoya's face went pale as helicopters appeared overhead, their spotlights pinning down his remaining forces. Miguel's trap hadn't just been about the town. He'd coordinated with multiple agencies, timing everything perfectly. "Pull back," Montoya ordered. "Everyone pull back." But retreat was no longer an option. Miguel had anticipated every escape route. State police blocked the highways. DEA tactical teams had quietly surrounded the area. Even the backcountry roads were covered by local deputies. 20 years of planning had created a perfect closure. 15 years, Miguel's voice came across their radio frequency. 15 years watching you rebuild what we took down in Mexico. Watching you get careless, confident, waiting for you to put all your resources in one place. Sarah watched from her cafe window as cartel members began surrendering in groups. The sight of hardened criminals dropping their weapons, hands raised, was almost surreal. "South side clear," Wilson reported. 7 in custody. "East side secure," another voice confirmed. 5 more detained. Miguel's voice remained steady. "Remember, secure and document everything. Every weapon, every vehicle, every phone. It's all evidence." Montoya, his position rapidly deteriorating, made one last desperate move. He and his core team charged toward Vista Ridge Ranch, thinking to either escape through the backcountry or take a final revenge. "He's heading for the ranch," Deputy Gonzalez reported urgently. "Good." Miguel's smile was cold. "That's where the main evidence is stored. Let him go right where we want him." The ranch, dark and seemingly deserted, beckoned Montoya's group like a sanctuary. They didn't realize they were charging straight into the heart of Miguel's trap, where the most damning evidence of their organization's crimes had been carefully assembled. From her vantage point, Emma watched the operation unfold with growing amazement. "All these years," she whispered to Sarah, "we thought he was just a quiet rancher, but he was building this piece by piece." "Not building," Miguel's voice surprised them as he emerged from the shadows. "Preparing justice. Sometimes it needs time to ripen." The night was far from over. Montoya and his core team were cornered, but dangerous. Yet as Miguel mounted his horse to confront them at the ranch, his expression wasn't of a man heading into danger, but of a hunter whose trap had finally sprung perfectly. The cartel was about to learn why his old nickname wasn't just about his silent approach. It was about the unstoppable force that followed the quiet. In the command center, Wilson watched the feeds as the operation unfolded. "Never seen anything like this," he told Deputy Gonzalez. "It's not just about catching them. It's about building an airtight case." "That's why he waited so long," she replied, understanding dawning. He wasn't just setting a trap for their bodies. He was building a trap for their entire organization. Today. And as the night deepened, that trap was closing with the inexorable force of 20 years of patience finally bearing fruit. Montoya and his remaining men crashed through Miguel's ranch gate, their vehicle's headlights cutting through the darkness. The main house stood silent, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. Behind them, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. "Spread out," Montoya ordered, his voice tight with rage. "Turn this place upside down. Find anything we can use against him." Escalante, nursing a bullet wound in his shoulder, tried to reason with his boss. "We should run while we can. El Fantasma's got federal backup. He's got evidence." "Evidence!" Montoya snapped. 20 years of surveillance. We find it, destroy it. There's still a chance to salvage something." They breached the house, finding it meticulously organized but eerily empty. No personal photos adorned the walls. No mementos cluttered the surfaces. It was a place designed for function, not comfort. The lair of a hunter rather than a home. "Check the basement," Montoya commanded. But as his men moved toward the door, floodlights suddenly blazed to life outside, turning night into day. "Interesting thing about evidence," Miguel's voice carried clearly from somewhere in the darkness. "Best kind isn't papers or photographs. Best kind is testimony, living witnesses." Montoya spun, firing blindly toward the voice. His bullets thudded into wooden walls as Miguel's words seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Your operation's already done," Miguel continued. "DEA raiding your warehouses in 4 states, FBI moving on your money laundering operations, ATF hitting your weapons caches, all coordinated, all happening right now." "How?" Montoya's voice cracked. "How could you know everything?" "Because I was you once." Miguel's tone shifted, carrying old pain. "Deep cover operative, living the life, building trust. Then someone in your organization found out who I was. They didn't just try to kill me. They went after my family, my wife. My daughter made me watch." The revelation hung in the air. Now Montoya remembered the legendary operation that had nearly destroyed the cartel a generation ago, started by an agent who'd lost everything. The story was still told in whispers, how he'd hunted down every person involved, not with blind vengeance, but with a cold, methodical precision that had earned him his ghostly nickname. Miguel emerged from the shadows, his rifle trained steadily on Montoya. "But you know what I learned. Revenge is quick. Justice takes patience. So I waited, watched, built something bigger than just taking you down. Built a case that will destroy the entire system that protects people like you." Escalante and the others were already surrendering, dropping their weapons as federal agents swarmed the property. But Montoya wasn't finished. "Should have stayed dead, Ghost," he snarled, raising his gun with lightning speed. Miguel was faster. His first shot took Montoya's gun hand, the second his shoulder. The cartel boss crashed to the floor, his last. Attempted violence failing like everything else this night. "Found something," an agent called from the barn. "Hidden elevator leads to some kind of command center." Sheriff Wilson arrived as they were bringing up the first boxes of evidence. The underground facility was a testament to Miguel's patience. Walls covered with photos, documents, maps, 20 years of surveillance, all meticulously organized. "Started building this place the day I bought the ranch," Miguel explained, leading them through the facility. Knew someone would try to use this valley eventually. Perfect corridor for drug running, human trafficking. Just had to wait for the right organization to take the bait. The evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance photos showed cartel operations across multiple states. Financial records traced money laundering through seemingly legitimate businesses. Names, dates, locations, everything needed to dismantle not just Montoya's operation, but the entire corrupt system that supported it. Those cameras you planted around town, Wilson shook his head in amazement. They were just the final piece, weren't they? Needed to document everything. Miguel nodded. Build an airtight case, not just against the cartel, but against every corrupt official who helped them, every business that laundered their money. Sarah appeared at the barn entrance, carrying coffee and food for the law enforcement teams. Her eyes widened at the sight of the command center. All these years, she said softly, having breakfast at my cafe, reading your paper. Best. Cover is a simple one, Miguel replied. Quiet rancher keeping to himself. Nobody looks too hard at a man like that. FBI agents were already processing the scene, cataloging evidence, securing prisoners. Montoya sat handcuffed, watching his empire crumble in real time as reports came in of simultaneous raids across the country. Your old task force has been waiting for this, an FBI commander told Miguel. They'll be handling the prosecution. With this evidence, we're looking at RICO charges that'll put them away for life. Deputy Gonzalez, helping to process prisoners, overheard Montoya talking. To himself, 20 years. He spent 20 years setting this up. Who does that? Someone who understands that true justice takes time, Miguel answered, passing by. Someone who learned the hard way that rushing in gets people killed. As dawn approached, the full scope of the operation became clear. The cartel's entire command structure was in custody, their assets frozen, their properties seized, their corruption exposed. But more importantly, the evidence Miguel had gathered would lead to dozens of arrests in law enforcement, politics, and business. The entire infrastructure that allowed organizations like Montoya's to operate. Emma arrived with fresh coffee, having opened her store early to support the law enforcement teams. Town won't be the same after this, she observed. No, Miguel agreed. It'll be better, safer. What about you? Wilson asked. Operation's over. Will you stay? Miguel looked out over the valley, now bustling with federal vehicles and evidence teams. For 20 years, he'd lived for this moment, driven by the ghosts of his past and the promise of justice. Ranch needs tending, he said finally. Town needs watching. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Besides, someone needs to keep an eye out for the next bunch that thinks this valley is ripe for taking. The sun rose over the Chisos Basin, illuminating a changed landscape. The cartel was finished. Their threat ended not by violence alone, but by the patience of a man who'd learned to play the long game. But as Miguel watched the activity around his ranch, he knew this wasn't really the end. Somewhere out there, other organizations would hear about what happened here. Some would be smart enough to stay away. Others would see it as a challenge, and that was fine with Miguel. He had time, he had patience, and he had a town worth protecting, not just from the cartels, but from whatever came next. The quiet. Rancher would keep his watch, ready for the next storm on the horizon, because some ghosts never rest and some legends never die. They just wait patiently in the shadows, watching and preparing for the moment when justice demands they step into the light once more. The morning after the raid, the Chisos Basin felt like a town awakening from a long dream. FBI evidence teams worked methodically through Miguel's underground command center, while state police processed the long line of arrested cartel members. News helicopters circled overhead, kept at a distance by temporary flight restrictions. Sarah's cafe had become an unofficial briefing center, serving coffee and meals to law enforcement personnel. Miguel sat in his usual booth, but now everyone knew to give him space. The weight of his exposed identity hung heavy in the air. "Channel 7 wants an interview," Sheriff Wilson said, sliding into the booth opposite Miguel. "So do half the national news networks." "Not interested," Miguel replied, studying his coffee. "Fame makes the work harder. Best operations happen in shadows." But as they talked, the evidence teams made a stunning discovery that would change everything. Agent Thompson burst into the cafe, his face flushed with excitement. "Commander, you need to see this. Your surveillance didn't just catch the cartel. We've got evidence of meetings between Montoya and representatives from 3 other major cartels. They were planning to turn the Chisos Basin into their primary hub for the entire Southwest." Miguel's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. "Show me." In the command center, they watched footage of Montoya meeting with leaders from the Gulf Cartel, Los Zetas, and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. The implications were staggering. 4 major cartels working together, something unprecedented in the drug war. "This goes deeper than we thought," FBI Special Agent Diana Rivera said, joining them. "Your surveillance caught them discussing corrupt officials in 3 state governments, federal judges, even people in Washington. This isn't just about drugs anymore. It's about exposing systematic corruption at every level." Miguel nodded slowly. "That's why I waited so long. Needed them all in one place. Needed them comfortable enough to reveal their connections." Emma rushed in with more news. "Got word from my contact in the State Department. Your evidence has triggered investigations in 6 countries. The money trails you documented, they lead to banks in Europe, Asia, even some major Wall Street firms." The scope of what Miguel had uncovered was expanding by the hour. His patient surveillance hadn't just documented criminal activities. It had mapped out an entire hidden economy of corruption and influence. Dr. Chen arrived with medical reports from the previous night's operation. "Not a single fatality," he announced. "Your plan worked perfectly. Controlled response, non-lethal targeting. We've got 32 cartel members who can testify. Living witnesses are better than dead." "Martyrs," Miguel replied. "Each one can help build the case stronger." Deputy Gonzalez brought more revelations. "Sir, remember those real estate purchases Montoya was pushing for? We found evidence they were planning to build a network of legitimate businesses, horse farms, ranches, all perfectly positioned to move product across the border without raising suspicion. Just like your ranch," Wilson realized. "They wanted to copy your cover, not knowing it was a trap all along." Sarah organized a town meeting that evening. The cafe was packed as Miguel explained what would come next. "Town's going to be in the spotlight for a while," he warned. "Media, law enforcement, probably some cartel representatives trying to figure out what happened. But we've got something they don't expect. A community that knows how to watch, how to prepare, how to stand together." Emma shared intelligence from her network of contacts. already getting reports of other communities wanting to learn from us. They want to know how we did it, how we stood up to them. It's not about fighting, Miguel explained. It's about patience, preparation, documentation, building something they can't break because they can't understand it, unity. The impact of the raid continued to ripple outward. The FBI's Organized Crime Division was using Miguel's methods as a new template for long-term operations. His patient approach to gathering evidence, building community support, and coordinating multiple agencies was becoming a model for future investigations. "Got something you should see," Agent Rivera said late that evening. She pulled up financial records on her laptop. "Your surveillance caught more than just cartel operations. We found evidence of political corruption going back decades. Senators, governors, judges, all taking money to look the other way." Miguel studied the data. "Good. That's the real target. Not just the criminals, but the system that protects them." Sarah brought fresh coffee as they worked. "You knew, didn't you? All those years, reading your paper in my cafe. You knew it would end like this." "Knew it would end," Miguel corrected softly. "Didn't know it would open up something bigger. Sometimes justice grows beyond what you planned." The night deepened, but the work continued. FBI teams were discovering that Miguel's evidence wasn't just thorough. It was strategically gathered to trigger multiple investigations, each one leading to new revelations. "It's like dominoes," Wilson observed. "Each piece of evidence leads to another. Each arrest opens up new leads. You didn't just build a case, you built a cascade." Deputy Gonzalez coordinated with state police as more law enforcement agencies arrived to study Miguel's methods. Everyone wants to know how one man could accomplish something that entire task forces couldn't. "Not one man," Miguel corrected. "One community. Town didn't just hide me. It became part of the operation. Every person who kept quiet, every detail they noticed but didn't share with outsiders. All of it mattered." Emma's store had become a coordination center for the expanding investigation. "Got reports from 3 more border towns," she announced. "They're starting to organize, set up their own surveillance networks. Your methods are spreading." "Good," Miguel nodded. "Cartels expect violence, expect resistance. They don't know how to fight communities that just watch and wait, building evidence day by day." The broader implications were becoming clear. Miguel hadn't just taken down a cartel operation. He'd created a blueprint for how small communities could stand, up to organized crime through patience, preparation, and unity. "It's not about guns," he explained to a group of visiting law enforcement officials. "It's about information, documentation, coordination, building something they can't fight because they can't see it until it's too late." Sarah's cafe remained, open through the night, becoming a symbol of the town's resilience. "You've given people more than safety," she told Miguel. "You've given them a way to fight back without becoming what they're fighting against." As dawn approached, Miguel stood on his ranch porch, watching the valley he'd chosen 20 years ago. The lights of law enforcement vehicles still moved through the darkness, but something else was moving too. Hope spreading from community to community as people learned they weren't helpless against organized crime. "What happens now?" Wilson asked, joining him. "Now we teach," Miguel replied. "Show others what we learned, build something bigger than just one operation or one town." He smiled slightly. After all, ghost stories spread fast, especially when they show people how to overcome their fears. The sun rose over the Chisos Basin, But the light it brought was different now. The quiet rancher had done more than expose a criminal enterprise. He'd illuminated a path forward for communities, everywhere, showing that patience, unity, and careful preparation could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. And somewhere in the growing light, other communities were already beginning to follow that path, learning that sometimes the most powerful weapon against darkness isn't a gun or a badge, it's the patient, united strength of people who refuse to be afraid, who learn to watch, wait, and stand together until justice finally ripens into truth. A week after the raid, the true magnitude of Miguel's operation began to emerge. FBI analysts working through his evidence discovered something unprecedented, a complete mapping of North American cartel operations, documented with a level of detail that left veteran agents speechless. "Look at this," Special Agent Rivera said, spreading maps across the command center table. He didn't just track Montoya's operation. Every cartel movement through Texas for the past 20 years, routes, connections, corrupt officials. It's all here. But the most stunning revelation came from an unexpected source. Emma burst into the cafe where Miguel sat with Sheriff Wilson, her face flushed with excitement. "The banking records," she said, laying down a thick folder. "Your surveillance didn't just catch drug money. These transactions, they're connected to major Wall Street firms, European banks, even some sovereign wealth funds." Miguel nodded slowly. "Follow the money long enough, you find the real power. Cartels are just the visible part." The evidence had triggered investigations across 3 continents. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit was uncovering a web of corruption that stretched from street-level drug operations to the highest levels of international finance. "It's not just about drugs anymore," Agent Thompson explained during a briefing. "We're looking at systematic corruption in banking, real estate, even some Fortune 500 companies. Commander Reyes didn't just build a case against criminals. He exposed an entire shadow economy." Sarah's cafe had become a hub for law enforcement briefings. As she served coffee to yet another group of federal agents, she noticed something changing in the town. People walked taller, spoke more freely. The fear that had always lurked beneath the surface was being replaced by something else. Pride. "You did more than protect us," she told Miguel that evening. "You showed us we could protect ourselves." But the work was far from over. Miguel's methods were being studied and replicated by law enforcement agencies worldwide. His patient approach to gathering evidence and building community support was becoming a new model for fighting organized crime. "Got requests from 5 police departments," Wilson reported. "They want to learn your surveillance techniques, your community organization methods. Teach them the important part," Miguel replied. "Patience, unity, building something criminals can't fight because they can't understand it." The impact spread beyond law enforcement. Communities along the border were organizing, creating their own networks of observation and documentation. Miguel's approach had shown them that they didn't need violence to fight back. They needed unity, preparation, and the patience to build an unbreakable case. Dr. Chen brought news from his medical colleagues. 3 border clinics have started documenting cartel activities using your methods. Not just crimes, they're tracking the human cost, building evidence that can't be ignored. Deputy Gonzalez coordinated with these emerging networks. "It's like a wave," she told Miguel. "Each community that stands up inspires others. They're not just fighting cartels anymore. They're building something new." The transformation was most visible in the Chisos Basin itself. The town had become a symbol of resistance, but not through violence or force. They had learned to watch, document, and stand together, turning their entire community into a network that criminals couldn't penetrate. Emma's hardware store had evolved into a training center. Got people coming from all over, she reported. Not just law enforcement, community leaders, teachers, business owners, they all want to learn how to protect their towns. Teach them the basics, Miguel instructed. Observation points, documentation methods, communication networks, but most importantly, teach them patience. Quick victories don't last. Real change takes time. The evidence Miguel had gathered continued yielding results. The FBI's Organized Crime Division was using his documentation as a blueprint for future operations. His meticulous approach to building cases had shown them that successful investigations required more than just surveillance. They needed community involvement. "Your methods are changing how we think about law enforcement," Agent Rivera told him. "It's not just about arrests anymore. It's about building networks of trust, creating systems that make criminal operations impossible to maintain." Sarah organized community workshops, teaching other towns how to implement Miguel's strategies. "The key is unity," she explained to a group from El Paso. "Every person becomes an observer, every business a potential documentation point. Criminals expect resistance. They don't expect an entire community working together." The international impact was growing. Miguel's evidence had triggered investigations in 12 countries, exposing corruption networks that had operated with impunity for decades. But more importantly, his methods were being adopted by communities worldwide. "Got word from Colombia," Wilson shared. 3 towns used your surveillance techniques to document paramilitary activities, built enough evidence to trigger federal investigations." Miguel's quiet approach had revealed something powerful, that communities didn't need to match criminals' violence to defeat them. They needed patience, organization, and the unity to stand together until justice could no longer be denied. Late one evening, as Miguel watched the sunset from his ranch porch, Emma brought him news that proved the true value of his work. "Remember that family that lost their daughter to cartel violence last year? They've started a network of their own, teaching other families how to document criminal activities, build cases, protect their communities." "That's how it spreads," Miguel said softly. "Not through force, but through people learning they have the power to change things. Just takes time and unity." The transformation continued. Each day brought new stories of communities standing up, not with guns or violence, but with cameras, documents, and the patient strength of people working together. Miguel's legacy wasn't just the cartel members in custody or the corruption exposed. It was the awakening of communities to their own power. "You've started something bigger than taking down Montoya," Sarah told him one evening. "You've shown people they don't have to be afraid." Miguel watched the lights of his town, each one representing not just a home, but a point of resistance against corruption. "Fear's what they expect," he replied. "Unity's what they can't fight." As night fell over the Chisos Basin, the quiet rancher who had spent 20 years building a case now watched something even more powerful being built. A network of communities learning to stand together, patient and strong, until justice finally ripened into lasting change. And somewhere in the darkness, other ghosts were stirring, not of violence or revenge, but of hope, spreading from town to town, teaching people that their greatest strength wasn't in fighting back, but in standing together, watching, waiting, and building something that no amount of corruption could tear down. The quiet revolution Miguel had started was just beginning, and its power lay not in the thunder of guns, but in the patient, united strength of people who had learned that true justice grows best in the light of hope and the soil of community. 2 weeks after the raid, Miguel received a call that changed everything. "Got something you need to see?" Agent Rivera's voice was tight with urgency. "We found a connection in your evidence. It leads back to your family's murder." The quiet. Rencher stood in the FBI's temporary command center, studying documents spread across the table. Financial records, surveillance photos, and encrypted communications painted a picture he'd waited 20 years to see. "The hit team that killed your wife and daughter," Rivera explained. "They weren't just cartel enforcers. They were working for someone inside the DEA, Assistant Director Marcus Hayes." Miguel's face remained impassive, but his hands tightened on the edge of the table. Hayes had been his mentor, the man who'd recruited him into the agency, trained him in deep cover operations. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet. "Hayes was on Montoya's payroll," Rivera continued. "When your investigation got too close to his corruption, he ordered the hit, used your family to send a message." But Hayes had miscalculated. Instead of breaking Miguel, he'd created something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose, and the patience to build an operation that would expose not just cartels, but the entire system of corruption that protected them. "He's still in position," Rivera said. "Deputy Director now. Your evidence has him scared. He's been destroying files, cutting ties, trying to cover his tracks." Sarah found Miguel on his ranch porch that evening, staring at the sunset. "You knew, didn't you? All these years you were building more than just a case against Montoya." "Justice needs to be complete," Miguel replied softly. "Not just the trigger men, but the ones who gave the orders." The next morning brought news that shook the law enforcement community. Hayes had arrived in Texas, officially to oversee the cartel investigation. But Miguel recognized it for what it was: a desperate attempt to control the damage, to bury evidence before it could expose decades of corruption. Hayes made his entrance with typical arrogance, striding into Sarah's cafe, flanked by federal agents. His expensive suit and polished manner seemed out of place among the local residents, but his eyes carried the same cold calculation Miguel remembered. "Quite an operation you've built here, Ghost," Hayes said, sliding into Miguel's booth uninvited. "Impressive surveillance network, thorough documentation, almost like you had inside knowledge of how we build cases." "Learned from the best," Miguel replied quietly. "You taught me everything about patience, about waiting for the right moment." Hayes's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You always were my best student. That's why this is such a waste. All this evidence, all these arrests, it stops at Montoya. The wider implications, the political connections, they're being contained. Orders from Washington." "Like the orders you gave 20 years ago?" Miguel's voice carried an edge of steel. "The ones that killed my family?" Hayes's composure cracked slightly. "That was unfortunate, but necessary. You were getting too close, asking too many questions. Had to maintain control." "Control," Miguel repeated softly. "Like the control you think you still have? Check your phone." Hayes's phone buzzed. His face paled as he read the message. Across the country, evidence Miguel had gathered was being released to multiple agencies and news organizations. Every corrupt deal Hayes had made, every order he'd given, every dollar he'd taken, all of it exposed in a cascade of revelations that couldn't be contained. "What have you done?" Hayes whispered. "Learned another lesson you taught me," Miguel replied. "Always have backup plans. Every piece of evidence I gathered is stored in multiple locations, set to release automatically if anything happens to me or if certain officials try to bury the investigation." The cafe had gone silent, watching the confrontation between mentor and student, betrayer and betrayed. Deputy Gonzalez entered, her face grim. "Sir," she addressed Hayes, "you need to see this. Your security clearance has been revoked. There's a warrant for your arrest." Hayes stood slowly, his world crumbling around him. "You don't understand what you've done. The system exists for a reason. There are bigger pictures." "The only picture that matters is justice," Miguel cut him off. "Real justice, not your corrupted version. 20 years you thought I was hiding, but I was building something you couldn't stop, a case so solid, so public, that not even your connections could bury it. Federal agents entered the cafe, but these weren't Hayes's men. They were from internal affairs, carrying badges and warrants that represented the justice Miguel had waited so long to see. "Marcus Hayes," the lead agent announced. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and the murder of Maria and Isabella Reyes." As they led Hayes away in handcuffs, Sarah approached Miguel's booth. "Is it really over?" "This part is," Miguel replied. "But the work continues. Hayes was just one piece of a bigger system. There are others like him, other communities that need to learn what we learned, that patience and unity are stronger than corruption." The impact of Hayes's arrest rippled through law enforcement agencies nationwide. His connections had run deep, protecting corrupt officials and criminal organizations for decades. But Miguel's evidence was unraveling all of it, exposing a network of corruption that had seemed untouchable. "Got word from Washington," Wilson reported later that day. 23 federal officials suspended, 6 judges under investigation. "Your evidence is triggering the biggest corruption probe in DEA history." Emma brought reports from her network of contacts. "It's not just law enforcement. Banks are being audited, political campaigns investigated. The whole system of protection is falling apart." Miguel's patient approach had done more than expose individual criminals. It had revealed the machinery that allowed corruption to flourish. His methods were being studied not just as a way to fight crime, but as a blueprint for dismantling systematic corruption. "You've changed more than just our town," Dr. Chen told him that evening. "You've shown people that the system isn't invincible, that patience and truth can overcome even the most entrenched corruption." As night fell over the Chisos Basin, Miguel stood on his ranch porch, thinking of his family. 20 years of patience had finally brought justice for them, but it had also created something larger, a movement that would continue growing, spreading from community to community, showing people they had the power to stand against corruption. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, bringing his evening coffee. Miguel watched the lights of his town, each one representing not just a home, but a point of resistance against corruption. "Now we build something they can never tear down," he replied. "A network of communities that know how to watch, how to document, how to stand together until justice is served." The quiet rancher had done more than avenge his family. He'd created a legacy of hope, showing people that even the most powerful corruption can be defeated by patience, unity, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. His story would be told not as a tale of revenge, but as a lesson in how justice, though slow, grows strongest when nurtured by the patient strength of united communities. And somewhere in the growing darkness, other communities were already beginning to follow his path, learning that their greatest power lay not in violence or force, but in the quiet strength of people who refuse to be broken, who learn to watch, wait, and stand together until truth finally prevails. 1 month after Hayes's arrest, the Chisos Basin had become a symbol of hope for communities across the nation. The morning sun painted long shadows across Vista Ridge Ranch as Miguel stood in his command center, now transformed into a training facility where law enforcement and community leaders came to learn his methods. Your surveillance techniques are revolutionizing how we fight corruption, Agent Rivera explained to a group of visiting officials. But the real innovation isn't the technology, it's the community integration. The evidence Miguel had gathered continued yielding unprecedented results. Federal investigators had uncovered corruption networks in 32 states, leading to the arrests of over 200 officials. But more importantly, communities were learning to protect themselves. "Got something special to show you?" Emma called from her monitoring station. She pulled up footage from a small town in Arizona. They used your methods to document cartel activities, built a case so strong that when federal agents arrived, they already had everything they needed for convictions. Miguel watched the screens with quiet satisfaction. The town had followed his template perfectly. Patient observation, detailed documentation, and above all, complete community unity. No violence, no confrontation, just the steady accumulation of evidence that corruption couldn't fight. Sarah burst in with more news. 3 more communities just reported successful operations. They're calling it the Ghost Protocol. Your methods of building cases through patient surveillance and community cooperation. It's spreading faster than we anticipated, Sheriff Wilson added. Got requests from police departments in 5 countries. They all want to learn how one town managed to take down not just a cartel, but an entire system of corruption. Dr. Chen arrived with reports from his medical network. The impact goes beyond law enforcement, he explained. Communities are using your documentation methods to track everything from environmental violations to corporate corruption. They're learning that evidence, properly gathered and protected, is more powerful than any weapon. The transformation was most visible in how communities viewed themselves. Instead of feeling helpless against organized crime and corruption, they were discovering their own strength, the power of united people who refused to be intimidated. Deputy Gonzalez coordinated with the expanding network of trained observers. Each success story inspires more communities to adopt your methods, she told Miguel. They're learning that they don't need to match the criminals' violence. They need to outsmart them with patience and preparation. Miguel's command center had become a hub for this quiet revolution. The walls, once covered with cartel surveillance, now displayed maps showing the spread of his methods across the country. Each point of light represented a community that had learned to stand together against corruption. Your evidence isn't just convicting criminals, Agent Rivera reported. It's changing how we think about community-based law enforcement. The old model of top-down control is being replaced by networks of informed, coordinated citizens. Emma's hardware store had evolved into a coordination center for this growing movement. "Got word from 3 border towns," she announced. "They've started their own surveillance networks, all linked together. Cartels can't move without being documented." The impact reached beyond criminal justice. Miguel's methods were being adapted to fight various forms of institutional corruption. Corporate whistleblowers were using his documentation techniques to expose fraud. Environmental groups were applying his surveillance strategies to track polluters. "It's becoming something bigger than we imagined," Sarah reflected, serving coffee. "To yet another group of visiting officials. You didn't just show us how to fight cartels. You showed us how to stand up to any form of corruption." The international response was particularly striking. Communities from Mexico to Colombia were adopting the Ghost Protocol, creating networks of observation and documentation that made criminal operations increasingly difficult to maintain. "Got reports from 6 countries," Wilson shared. "Your methods are being used to expose everything from human trafficking to government corruption. The cartels are finding it harder to operate when entire communities are watching and documenting their every move." Miguel's approach had revealed something powerful, that corruption thrives in shadows but withers under the steady light of patient observation and documented truth. His 20-year operation had become a template for systematic change. Late one evening, as training sessions wound down, a young community leader from El Paso approached Miguel. "My sister was killed by cartel violence," she said. "We felt helpless, afraid, but your story, your methods, they gave us something we didn't have before." "Hope," Miguel finished softly. "More than hope," she corrected. "You gave us a way to fight back without becoming what we're fighting against, a way to turn our pain into purpose." The transformation continued spreading. Each day brought news of more communities adopting Miguel's methods, more corruption exposed, more networks of protection dismantled. But the real change was in how people viewed their own power. "You've started something that can't be stopped," Dr. Chen observed. "Communities are learning that their greatest strength isn't in weapons or violence. It's in their unity and patience." Emma brought reports of another successful operation, this time from a small town in New Mexico. "They documented cartel activities for 6 months," she explained. "When they finally moved, they had enough evidence to take down not just the local operators, but their entire support network." "That's the key," Miguel told the gathered observers. "Don't just target the visible criminals. Document everything. The corrupt officials, the money launderers, the business fronts. Build a case that exposes the entire system." The Quiet Rancher's methods had revealed a fundamental truth: that corrupt power, no matter how entrenched, cannot survive when confronted with the patient, documented truth gathered by united communities. As night fell over the Chisos Basin, Miguel stood on his ranch porch, watching the lights of his town. Each one represented not just a home, but a point in a growing network of resistance against corruption. His 20-year wait had created something far more powerful than a single operation. It had sparked a movement that would continue growing, spreading from community to community. "What you've built here," Sarah said, joining him with his evening coffee, "it's changing more than just how we fight crime. It's changing how people see themselves, their power to make things right." Miguel nodded, watching the stars emerge above his valley. His quest for justice had evolved into something larger than revenge or even law enforcement. It had become a lesson in how communities could reclaim their power, not through violence, but through the patient strength of people working together to expose truth. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, other communities were already following his path, learning that their greatest weapon against corruption wasn't force or fear, but the quiet power of united people who refused to be silenced, who learned to watch, wait and stand together until justice finally prevailed. The ghost's legacy would live on, not in the thunder of gunfire, but in the steady light of truth shining from countless communities that had learned to protect themselves through patience, unity, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. 3. Months after Hayes's arrest, a new kind of transformation began sweeping through communities across the Americas. Miguel stood in his expanded command center, now a bustling hub of activity, where screens displayed real-time feeds from dozens of towns implementing his methods. "Look at this," Agent Rivera said, pointing to a cluster of lights on the main map. "Every point represents a community that successfully adapted your surveillance network. They're not just fighting cartels anymore, they're changing how entire regions handle corruption." The evidence from Miguel's 20-year operation had triggered a cascade of revelations that continued to shake institutions of power. Federal investigators had uncovered corruption networks reaching into the highest levels of government, finance, and law enforcement. "Latest numbers are staggering," Emma reported, reviewing data from her international contacts. 17 cartel operations disrupted, 43 corrupt officials arrested, and over $2 billion in illegal assets frozen, all using your documentation methods. But the most profound change wasn't in the statistics or arrests. It was in how communities viewed their own power. Towns that had once lived in fear of organized crime were discovering that their greatest strength lay not in confrontation, but in patient, coordinated observation. Sarah burst in with news that perfectly illustrated this transformation. "Remember that small town in Sonora that everyone thought was lost to the cartels? They just completed their first successful operation using your methods. 6 months of quiet documentation, and they brought down an entire trafficking network without firing a shot." "That's not even the best part," Deputy Gonzalez added. "Their evidence exposed corruption in local government, leading to reforms that will make it harder for criminals to establish control in the future." Dr. Chen brought reports from his expanding medical network. "Communities are applying your documentation techniques to track more than just criminal activities. They're monitoring environmental violations, corporate misconduct, even political corruption. The methodology works because it's adaptable." The transformation had spread far beyond law enforcement. Miguel's patient approach to gathering evidence and building community support had become a template for addressing various forms of systemic abuse. "Got an interesting case from Colombia," Wilson shared. "A network of small farmers used your surveillance methods to document corporate land grabs, built such a solid case that international courts had to take action. The impact on criminal organizations was profound. Cartels that had operated with impunity for decades found themselves facing a new kind of resistance, not armed confrontation, but the steady accumulation of documented evidence by united communities. "They can't adapt to it," Agent Rivera explained during a training session. "Their whole system is built on violence and intimidation. They don't know how to fight communities that just watch, document, and wait." Emma's coordination center tracked this quiet revolution's spread. Each successful operation inspires more communities to join the network. The cartels are finding it harder to move, harder to hide, harder to maintain their operations when every step is being documented. The international response had exceeded all expectations. Law enforcement agencies from multiple countries were adopting what they called the Ghost Protocol, Miguel's systematic approach to building cases through patient surveillance and community cooperation. Got requests from 30 countries now, Wilson reported. They all want to learn how one quiet rancher's methods managed to expose and dismantle corruption networks that seemed untouchable. Miguel's approach had revealed something powerful: that corrupt systems, no matter how entrenched, cannot survive when confronted with the patient, documented truth gathered by united communities. Late one evening, as training sessions wound down, a group of community leaders from Central America approached Miguel. One woman stepped forward, her eyes bright with determination. "My village lived under cartel control for 15 years, she said. "We tried everything, police, military, even forming our own militia. Nothing worked. But your methods, they showed us a different way. A way to fight without becoming what we're fighting against." Miguel nodded, understanding the deeper truth in her words. His 20-year wait had created something more powerful than any weapon, a methodology that allowed communities to reclaim their power without sacrificing their souls. The transformation continued spreading, taking new forms in different contexts. Environmental groups adapted Miguel's surveillance techniques to document corporate pollution. Labor rights advocates used his methods to expose workplace exploitation. Anti-corruption activists applied his approach to tracking political misconduct. "Your impact goes beyond crime fighting," Dr. Chen observed. "You've created a template for systematic change that works because it's built on human nature, people's natural ability to observe, document, and stand together against injustice." Emma brought reports of another successful operation, this time from a coalition of border towns. They coordinated their surveillance networks, she explained. When one community spotted cartel activity, the entire network was alerted. The criminals had nowhere to hide. "That's the future," Miguel told the gathered observers. "Not isolated victories, but connected communities working together, sharing information, supporting each other. Corruption can't survive that kind of unified patience." As night fell over the Chisos Basin, Miguel stood on his ranch porch, watching the lights of his town. Each one represented not just a home, but a point in a growing constellation of resistance against corruption. His 20-year wait had created something far more powerful than a single operation. It had sparked a movement that would continue growing, spreading from community to community. "What you've built here," Sarah said, joining him with his evening coffee, "it's becoming something bigger than any of us imagined. You didn't just show us how to fight crime. You showed us how to transform entire societies." Miguel nodded, watching the stars emerge above his valley. His quest for justice had evolved into something larger than revenge or even law enforcement. It had become a lesson in how communities could reclaim their power, not through violence, but through the patient strength of people working together to expose truth. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, other communities were already following his path, learning that their greatest weapon against corruption wasn't force or fear, but the quiet power of united people who refused to be silenced, who learned to watch, wait, and stand together until justice finally prevailed. The ghost's legacy would live on, not in the thunder of gunfire, but in the steady light of truth, shining from countless communities that had learned to protect themselves through patience, unity, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. In the command center, a new generation of leaders was already being trained, learning not just surveillance techniques and documentation methods, but the deeper wisdom that Miguel had discovered during his 20-year vigil. That true change comes not from quick victories, but from the patient, unified strength of communities that refuse to be broken. And as the night deepened over the Chisos Basin, the quiet rancher who had waited so long for justice watched his methods spread like stars across the darkness, lighting the way for others to follow, showing that even the deepest corruption can be overcome by the patient, documented truth of people standing together. 6 months after Hayes' arrest, Miguel stood in the newly expanded International Training Center that had once been his hidden command bunker. The facility now hummed with activity as community leaders from across the globe came to learn the methods that had transformed the Chisos Basin from a cartel target into a beacon of hope. "Something remarkable happening in Brazil," Agent Rivera said, directing his attention to one of the main screens. "A network of favela communities adapted your surveillance methods. They're not just documenting cartel activities, they're tracking police corruption, political bribes, everything that keeps their neighborhoods trapped in cycles of violence." Miguel studied the footage with quiet satisfaction. The Brazilian communities had taken his basic methodology and evolved it, creating a sophisticated web of civilian observers who used their phones and social media to build cases against both criminals and corrupt officials. "They've added something new," Emma noted, pulling up more data. "When they spot cartel activity, they don't just document it. They immediately broadcast the information to every school, church, and business in the area. The whole community knows to shut down, denying criminals any space to operate." The innovation sparked similar adaptations across other regions. Communities were learning not just to observe and document, but to actively shape their environment in ways that made criminal operations increasingly difficult to maintain. Sarah arrived with more evidence of this evolution. 3 towns in Guatemala just completed their first coordinated operation. Instead of confronting the cartels directly, they used your documentation methods to expose the local businesses that were laundering money. Without their financial infrastructure, the criminal operations collapsed. "But here's what makes it truly special," Deputy Gonzalez added. "They didn't stop at exposing corruption. They're using the seized assets to fund community development, new schools, medical clinics, job training programs. They're not just fighting crime, they're building something better." Dr. Chen brought medical reports that revealed another dimension of the transformation. Communities are realizing that health and safety are connected. They're using your surveillance networks to track not just criminal activities, but public health issues, environmental hazards, even food security. It's becoming a comprehensive approach to community well-being. The impact on criminal organizations was unprecedented. Cartels that had operated with impunity for generations found themselves facing a new kind of adversary, not armed opponents, but networked communities that could document and expose every aspect of their operations. "Got something fascinating from Colombia," Wilson shared. "A coalition of indigenous communities adapted your methods to protect their ancestral lands. They're using drones and satellite imagery to document illegal mining, logging, and cartel activities." Their evidence has led to international sanctions against several major corporations. The transformation had spread far beyond its original scope. Miguel's patient approach to gathering evidence and building community support had become a template for addressing various forms of systemic injustice. The latest numbers are inspiring, Emma reported from her coordination center. Over 500 communities worldwide have successfully implemented your methods. They're not just fighting cartels anymore. They're taking on corporate polluters, corrupt politicians, human traffickers. The methodology works because it empowers people to protect themselves. But the most profound change was in how communities viewed their own potential. Towns that had once seen themselves as helpless victims were discovering their collective power to effect change through patient, coordinated action. A young leader from Honduras shared her community's experience during a training session. "We tried fighting the cartels with guns," she explained. "All it brought was more violence. Your methods showed us a different way. Now we fight with cameras, documents, and unity. We're not just surviving anymore, we're transforming our reality." Miguel's approach had revealed something revolutionary. That sustainable change comes not from confrontation, but from the patient accumulation of truth by united communities. His 20-year operation had evolved into a global movement for systemic transformation. "Got an interesting development in Eastern Europe," Agent Rivera reported. "Anti-corruption activists have adapted your surveillance techniques to document political corruption. They've created a network that tracks everything from illegal campaign contributions to suspicious real estate deals." The methodology's versatility proved one of its greatest strengths. Environmental groups used it to build cases against industrial polluters. Labor advocates adapted it to document workplace exploitation. Human rights organizations applied it to track government abuses. "Your impact goes beyond law enforcement," Dr. Chen observed during an evening briefing. "You've created a framework for community empowerment that works because it's based on fundamental human capabilities, the ability to observe, document, and stand together against injustice." Emma shared reports of another innovative application, this time from West Africa. Coastal communities have linked their surveillance networks to track illegal fishing operations. They're protecting their marine resources while documenting the international corporations that exploit them. "That's the real power of this approach," Miguel explained to a group of visiting leaders. "It's not about individual victories. It's about creating networks of informed, coordinated communities that can identify and address the root causes of their challenges." As sunset painted the Chisos Basin in golden light, Sarah found Miguel in his usual spot on the ranch porch. "I remember when you first came to town," she said, setting down his coffee. "Everyone thought you were just a quiet rancher. Now you've sparked a global revolution in how communities protect themselves." Miguel watched the deepening shadows, thinking of the long path that had led to this moment. His quest for personal justice had evolved into something far more significant, a methodology that allowed communities everywhere to reclaim their power and dignity. "The cartels understand force," he said softly. "They expect violence, resistance, fear. What they can't fight is patience, unity, and documented truth. That's why this works. It uses their own shadows against them." In the command center, screens showed the movement's continued spread. Each point of light represented a community. that had learned to stand together, to watch and document until truth could no longer be denied. The Ghost's methods had become a beacon, showing others that their greatest strength lay not in weapons, but in the patient power of united people, working to expose injustice. And as night fell over the valley, Miguel reflected on how his 20-year vigil had grown into something he never imagined, a quiet revolution that was transforming communities through the simple yet profound power of patient observation and coordinated action. The legacy would continue, spreading like starlight across the darkness, showing others that even the deepest corruption can be overcome when people learn to stand together, watching, waiting, and working patiently until justice finally prevails. 1 year after Hayes' arrest, Miguel stood before an international gathering in the Chisos Basin's newly constructed Community Defense Center. Representatives from 30 countries had come to celebrate what the media was calling the Ghost Revolution, a global transformation in how communities protect themselves against organized crime and systemic corruption. "Let me tell you about power," Miguel addressed the assembled leaders. "Real power isn't in weapons or violence. It's in the patient strength of people who learn to stand together, who understand that justice grows stronger in light than in shadows." Urdarsis, the evidence of this transformation, filled the center's main hall. Screens displayed live feeds from communities worldwide that had adapted Miguel's methods to their unique challenges. Each success story added new dimensions to the original methodology. "Look at what's happening in Peru," Agent Rivera highlighted. "Indigenous communities used our surveillance networks to document illegal mining operations. But they didn't stop. There, they created an economic alternative, developing sustainable enterprises that give young people options beyond working for the cartels." Emma brought forward more innovations from her global network. Communities in Southeast Asia have integrated traditional wisdom with modern technology. They're using ancient observation posts as locations for surveillance equipment, combining cultural heritage with contemporary defense methods. The methodology had evolved far beyond its original scope. Dr. Chen presented findings from a global health initiative that had adapted Miguel's approach. When communities in West Africa faced an Ebola outbreak, they used these surveillance networks to track infection patterns and coordinate responses. The same methods that expose criminal activities now save lives in medical crises. Sarah, who had transformed her cafe into an international meeting point, shared stories of personal transformation. A mother from Guatemala told me she used to pray her children would survive cartel violence. Now she teaches them to document corruption, to stand with their neighbors, to build something stronger than fear. The impact on criminal organizations had been revolutionary. Cartels that had relied on violence and intimidation found themselves facing an opponent they couldn't intimidate or corrupt. United communities armed with nothing more than cameras, notebooks, and unshakable patience. Latest analysis shows a 60% reduction in cartel activities across documented regions, Deputy Gonzalez reported. But the real change is in community resilience. Towns that implement these methods don't just drive out criminals, they transform themselves. Day Wilson brought evidence of this transformation from law enforcement perspectives. Police departments worldwide are rebuilding trust with their communities through these programs. When people feel empowered to document and address problems, they become partners in creating safety, not just victims needing protection. The methodology's adaptability proved its greatest strength. Environmental activists used it to expose corporate pollution. Labor rights advocates documented workplace exploitation. Anti-corruption campaigners tracked political misconduct. Each application added new tools to the community defense arsenal. "You've created something unprecedented," a UN observer told Miguel. "This isn't just about fighting crime. It's a new model for social transformation through coordinated civilian action." Emma's Coordination Center tracked this evolution in real time, got reports from 12 new regions implementing the program. Each one adds their own innovations. A fishing village in Thailand adapted our surveillance methods to track illegal trawlers. Now they're teaching other coastal communities to protect their maritime resources. The international impact continued growing. Miguel's patient approach to gathering evidence and building community support had become a template for addressing various forms of systemic injustice. Communities in the Amazon are using these methods to document illegal logging, Agent Rivera reported. They've created a network that tracks everything from initial tree marking to final timber transport. Their evidence has led to international sanctions against major corporations. But the most profound change was in how communities viewed their own potential. A tribal leader from Kenya shared his people's experience during the conference. "For generations, we accepted that certain forces were too powerful to fight," he said. "Now we understand that no power can withstand the patient truth gathered by united people. We don't need weapons to protect ourselves. We need unity, documentation, and time." Dr. Chen presented research showing the broader health impacts of these programs. When communities feel empowered to address systemic problems, we see improvements in mental health, social cohesion, even economic development. This isn't just about security, it's about comprehensive community well-being. The methodology's success in diverse contexts proved its universal applicability. Rural villages used it to protect against land grabs. Urban neighborhoods documented gang activities. Indigenous communities tracked environmental violations. Each success added new dimensions to the original approach. "Your impact goes beyond crime prevention," Sarah told Miguel during a quiet moment. "You've shown people they have the power to reshape their reality. Not through violence, but through patient, coordinated action." The transformation continued spreading, taking new forms in different contexts. A women's cooperative in Afghanistan adapted the surveillance techniques to document human rights violations. Teachers in Brazil used the methods to track corruption in education funding. Each application demonstrated the methodology's versatility. "The key is adaptation," Miguel explained to visiting leaders. "Each community faces unique challenges, but the basic principles remain the same: patient observation, detailed documentation, and unbreakable unity." As evening approached, the conference participants gathered for a final session. Miguel stood before them, his quiet presence commanding attention. "What we've built here isn't just a defense system," he said. "It's a way for communities to reclaim their power, their dignity, their future. The cartels understand force. They expect it, know how to fight it. What they can't fight is the patient strength of people who learn to stand together, who understand that true power grows in light, not shadows." The legacy would continue growing, spreading like dawn across the darkness, showing others that even the deepest corruption can be overcome when people learn to stand together, watching waiting and working patiently until justice finally prevails. As night fell over the Chisos Basin, Miguel returned to his ranch porch, watching the lights of his transformed community. Each point of brightness represented not just a home, but a beacon of hope for others following this path. "You know what's remarkable?" Sarah said, bringing his evening coffee. 20 years ago, you started this to bring justice for your family. Now you've given hope to families worldwide. Miguel nodded, watching the stars emerge. His long vigil had grown into something far beyond personal justice, a global movement that was transforming communities through the simple yet profound power of patient observation and coordinated action. The quiet rancher had become more than a legend. He had become a teacher, showing others that their greatest strength lay not in weapons or violence, but in the unwavering unity of people who refuse to be broken, who learn to watch, wait, and stand together until truth finally prevails. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, countless communities were already following this path, learning that real power comes not from force or fear, but from the patient strength of united people working to expose injustice and build something stronger than corruption, hope itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.